and a very competitive market that has driven the profession to reinvent itself and to rely less on the mere built environment. It is crucial for them to step out from only construction and go through a more polyvalent approach to offer an alternative mode of existing. Through this panel, we are going to discuss some of the following questions. How important is the agency of the architect, planner, in propagating urban and social change? How can inclusive and socially just policies provide alternative means for this dissemination of architectural practice? And finally, how can architectural urban practices and policies inform the production of urban, social, and domestic space beyond the capital investment? First, we're going to start with a keynote speech by Abir Saqsouk. Abir is an architect and urban planner. She has been involved in several research projects in Lebanon, including the history of informal suburbs, the social production of shared spaces, and housing rights. She is the co-founder of Dictaphone Group and Public Works Studio. Please allow me to introduce Abir Saqsouk.
Thank you, Samer. Anybody in the audience doesn't speak Arabic or understand Arabic? 2 people? 3 people. Ah, صح. Okay, I'll stick to English. I'm going to start with a very short video.
شو عم بخبوا معناتها؟
انا اللي شفته بتاني مان في كان
لك الزيتون؟
هيك خالطين الزباله مع تراب وتمرين.
هي الزيتون كان لنا يعني صار لعمتي هيك كيف صار.
قلت لي خالطين الزباله مع شو؟
مع التراب هونيك هذيك هون ما بعرف ولا مره شفت بس طلع في ودنيا.
هيك كيف هون صاير. بعد شوي بيجي البحر.
اوف
هيك انا من نص سنه ما كان.
ايه اوكي.
هيك كانت كلها على فرد سوية.
كلها كانت كل وادي خضراء كانت وكانت مجرى نهر من فوق.
سمير كانت موصوله لهونيك وكان في وادي صغير.
يعني والوادي كانت كثير صغيره كانت كلها غابات هون.
لميس راح الشلالات.
ايه راحوا.
وين كانت الشلالات؟
تحت بلاد.
هون بهالبياض هون.
شو كان اساميهم عندكم؟
لا
مش ما لهم اسامي بس كانوا حلوين يعني بنعمل سيران هونيك بنعمل مشاوي وشغلات راحوا.
So this video was taken during our field work in the town of Badboun and Koura. During the field work, we were stopped by a girl called Ro'a. She's a girl in her 20s. Having found us carrying maps and cameras, looking like experts or expert architects, she followed us to ask, are you from the municipality or from the planning directorate? What are these maps? What will happen to our house? Initially, we did not understand her completely or comprehend the severity of her concerns about the expansion of the quarry related to the cement factories found in the nearby town of Shikka. We didn't understand her, that is, until we realized that Ru'a's concerns were not just a story about her and her family and their home, but her concerns are about an entire group of people living on a certain patch of land and all the temporal and spatial circumstances that led to their presence and their clash with what we call as urban planning. Why was Ru'a's concern about her house and the destiny of her house so uncertain? And what is it about our relationship as experts and as architects? Why is our relationship so complex and difficult with ordinary citizens? I will be tackling these questions by presenting a project by Public Works Studio, and throughout it we'll be reflecting on our role as experts or professionals of the built environments, be these professionals be architects, planners, or other professionals related to the built environment and space. So for many decades, Lebanon has witnessed a deterioration in housing rights, the closure of beaches and the public, and the absence of public transport, not to mention the increasing borders and barriers between areas and around neighborhoods, the disappearance of open and green spaces from our everyday lives. The previous and current urban planning policies have disrupted people's day-to-day lives, distorted their built and natural surroundings, and constricted their ability to participate in the decisions that directly affect them. In this context, and in July 2017, Public Works Studio, in collaboration with the Legal Agenda, we launched a research project entitled Urbanism and Law, general master plans and their impact on everyday life. العنوان بالعربي, to be translated, it's the manufacturing of inequality in planning the Lebanese territories. In the project, we took a critical look at land use maps, in particular in 15 towns and villages in Lebanon, spanning from the north to the south. You can see them here jotted in white. In fact, after a year of interaction with people and places, sometimes very unfamiliar to us, it was not easy to draw lessons or conclusions. The process of writing about the topic is not very much different from the research process itself, as the experience was a mix of contradictions, anger, and contemplation that in the beginning paralyzes all our thoughts. Where do we begin? Initially, we found people's lives shattered and distorted, either covered in the dirt of a long war or surrounded by the odor of pollution or a sense of loss stemming from losing a home, a location, or a source of income. But we quickly became more aware that the individual and collective suffering we witnessed during our research in these places, and the situation usually dubbed as chaos, is not arbitrary nor imposed by reality. Rather, it was largely a result of poor planning or a defective vision. In fact, it was the outcome of expert practices of architects or urban planners. Some of the research findings in the beginning, I will just go over them and reflect on what we know and not know on the context of urban planning in Lebanon. So part of the research, apart from taking 15 case studies in Lebanon and looking how master plans were produced in these areas, we collected an archive of every single master plan produced in Lebanon from 1954 until today. And we put these master plans on a map. The map, this type of mapping brought us to the conclusion that until today, 85% of Lebanese territories are still unplanned. And the fact that such a large proportion of land is still unplanned is very much related to having things made ad hoc and being forced by the force of powerful representatives in each area. Another finding we also another reading we also made with these master plans that we archived is that we put them on a timeline from 1954 until today. If we exclude the time span of the Civil War from 75 to 90, we see that in the 15 years before the Civil War, the General Directorate of Urban Planning had produced 51 master plans for 82 towns. So 82 towns were planned in the 15 years before the Civil War. If we compare it to the 15 years after the Civil War, we see that the number has gone down to 28. And so we start to understand the practice of the General Directorate of Urban Planning and to what extent it's engaged in actually thinking about the future of areas and how they impact people, and the fact that it's thinking about its future through a master plan. But even this 15% of the Lebanese territory that's planned today, when we start to look how these master plans were produced, we intricately studied the legal framework, and we see that through a very intricate scheme of decision making, citizens have absolutely no involvement in this process. So the discussion on a master plan and what is the future of a certain town and how it impacts local resources, citizens, and so on, is all stuck within a vicious circle of the municipality as a local representative, when we know in the local politics that very rarely do municipalities represent their citizens, or through the General Directorate of Urban Planning, or through powerful citizens who are able to impose their opinion, namely landowners. So throughout this diagram, we understand that someone like Ru'a had no idea what would be coming to their town, or how their town is being planned, and what would actually the outcome or the future of her house be. So apart from actually being keen on producing such readings through mappings, and through it expanding of our idea of such type of knowledge not to be only centered with experts and with architects who know about them, it was very important for us to also tackle a multidisciplinary approach to research and to disseminate this information. So from the 15 towns that we conducted the research on, we decided to focus on the area of Shikka and to actually look at almost 100 years of planning in the area and what it meant to erect 2 cement factories at the coast of Shikka and how it affected the entire area. So in 1931, 2 cement factories were erected on the coast of Shikka and Hire. You can see them here in red. And next to them, 2 corresponding quarries were being erected. At the time, there were no land use plans. There was no national master plan to guide the construction of such industries in the area. It was all done arbitrarily, and it was covered by a vision of development, actually, that is centered on the construction industry, without taking into consideration the agricultural sector that was vibrant at the time. Actually, if you look at this aerial photograph, you can see how these 2 factories and their quarries lie within a massive agricultural field that characterized the area. And so, again, now, like 80 years afterwards, we did a mapping of the area to actually see the juxtaposition of the functions next to each other. So you see in red the 2 quarries related to the 2 factories in dark gray. In light gray are other industrial areas, and you can see their proximity to green zones and to residential areas. Now, if you look at the actual master plans around this area, you can see an almost a patchwork of land use that really doesn't make sense next to each other. And this one here in red is the town of Badbhoon that the girl Ru'a and the video you saw in the beginning. So Badbhoon has actually a very particular story, because in 1991, the Council of Ministers, in an unprecedented decision, took a decision to actually zone the entire town of Badbhoon as a town of quarries. So just through a decision of a pen and a paper, the entire town was designated as a quarrying area. This is a view of the town today, and this is a property map that we produced, where you can see how almost 25% of the town has been already quarried and owned by 1 cement factory. So the Council of Ministers decision that was issued in 1991 was a 10-year decision, and it was stopped in 2001. After that, the General Directorate of Urban Planning decided to zone the area because of a lot of pressure from citizens, and they've zoned it as mostly agricultural, with the land already being quarried as a land to be protected, meaning that the quarrying can't go further unless according to certain guidelines set by the Directorate of Planning. Now, sadly enough, the company who owned the land filed a lawsuit against the state, against the Directorate of Urban Planning, and won the lawsuit. And so the master plan for the area was halted, and again, it returned to being unplanned, and therefore quarrying activities would happen as the cement factory would like it to happen. And so what are we doing with all this research, and why this research? Part of our role as architects is actually to use tools used by the state and by planning to subvert them, to appropriate them, and to actually use them to open discussions and debates around important topics that influence our daily lives. So part of the methodologies that we've been going for is actually launching competitions that involve a larger number of architects, planners, ordinary citizens, social scientists, and so on, to think about important public topics, and the future of the built environment. So in the context of Kura and all the debates that were happening on the issue of the real estate sector, the construction sector versus other productive economies that have been deteriorating in the area, we're currently launching a competition entitled أبعد من الإسمنت, Beyond Cement, towards alternative visions for Shikka and the surrounding towns. So the site the competition takes 3 sites as its departure points and opens the door as an open call for all professionals of the built environment and of the environment more generally to take part in thinking about the future of this area. The competition takes the first site as the Kura agricultural plain that had been quarried in the 1960s, and the effects of the quarrying have been are still happening up until today, with negative effects on agriculture and on the towns that surround it. The second site is the seafront of Shikka and Hiri, where the 2 cement factories are located. So how can we make use of the competitive value of the seafront to actually start to think of alternative economic visions that can actually be competitive and will start to make the cement factories have less and less power in the area. And the third site is that of the quarry and of Badboun itself, and to think of how rehabilitation of quarries can take into consideration livelihoods, productive economies, and the environment around it. So by taking these 3 sites, we hope that we can start to think and to open a debate about what is development, what is our role as architects in the development of the Lebanese territories, and to start to open a debate about how development can go beyond the construction sector, beyond the dominant vision that it's only through real estate development and construction that we're able to build a national economy. How do we think of alternative development schemes that are able to take the environment and economic activities related to the environment as an asset to an area that has been shattered for almost 80 years? The competition is going to be launched on the 16th of September, and if you want to look, there's a website already been on now. It's beyondcement.org. And actually, one of the very important aspects of why a competition is the multidisciplinary role that architects should actually engage with. So understanding the framework within which other disciplines operate is a pressing need for interdisciplinary practice that's becoming more and more important as we face the challenges of our contemporary urban life. So given the coordinator role that architects have traditionally occupied, as they begin to view themselves as part of a larger community that's concerned with the built environments, architects can expand and diversify their services by playing a leading role in interdisciplinary collaborative teams. In conclusion, we see our architectural mission is to help develop socially and environmentally sustainable places in multiple contexts around the world, which we intend to carry out collaboratively with interdisciplinary professional teams. Consequently, our work as professionals focuses on broadening the scope of architectural knowledge, as well as creating connections with other fields of knowledge as a primary aspect in getting engaged in civic and public debates. Thank you.
Thank you, Abir, for this presentation. We're gonna take 2 or 3 questions for you. If you can remain on stage, please, from the audience. Anyone? No questions? Bernard.
Hi, Abir. Just a question about the competition. This is your initiative, I imagine. Is there any hope of any of those results you might obtain, or these solutions, or these proposals you might obtain by architects, any hope of any of this being applied?
We were taking several questions, or I think the most important aspect of actually coming up with alternatives is that these alternatives become advocacy tools. So it's not that I can tell you now that this is officially going to be endorsed. The competition is organized by Public Works Studio in collaboration with the Order of Engineers in Beirut and Tripoli, and under the auspices of the اتحاد بلديات الكورة. So engaging these public entities or official entities is very important in the future endorsement of whatever schemes could be actually won. And the fact that the اتحاد بلديات الكورة has adopted the battle to close the illegal quarries is in itself a very hopeful entry point. Now, all the rest is actually a matter of building a strong public opinion that would actually endorse that these quarrying and cement activities are actually problematic, because this topic has been struggled for only in the context of Kura, and has very rarely taken up a national يعني ما طلعت على المستوى الوطني. هالنقاش ما طلع فعليا على المستوى الوطني إلا بلحظات صغيرة. So a very important part of this competition is to actually engage architects from the entire country, and to use the case of Kura not only to solve the problem of Kura, but to actually open a debate about how is it that we define sustainable development. And why the issue of development particularly? Because in the research we did in the 15 areas before this phase of the project, we were actually being faced, because part of the research was that we did debates with residents in each town. And a very important obstacle to the debate has constantly been that we don't have an alternative. Like, the alternative is only we need to invest in land. So how can we open this debate of, okay, if we're not investing in land as a commodity, what economic alternatives are we debating, or are we saying are possible? And Kura is a very important case study for such a debate, because the area has a lot of valuable economic assets that have been completely marginalized throughout the years. So we really see it as a very important entry point for a national debate, even if we don't get to implementation.
I was just wondering about the sites you showed that are possible for the competition. In terms of area and space, like, do you think that kind of scale is possibly addressable by architects? And I mean, it seems like the quarry and the... Could we go to that slide? Yes, like number 1 and number 2 seem to engulf like a really large area of what can someone do. And I'm just wondering, like, are you looking for people to address the problematic from a realistic point of view, or from like a utopic point of view? Because, I mean, that's a question actually.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I want to also mention that Rula Khouri, who's coming up next, is part of the steering committee of the competition. Rula, if you want to add anything, also go ahead. Yeah, this sketch is actually very schematic. So in number 1, it's not actually looking at the entire Kura plain. We're actually looking at the pits that have been quarried in the 1960s. So they're almost 20 meters deep. And because they haven't been rehabilitated ever since, rain is still عم بيعبيهم, and it's yeah, the pits are still until...
Yeah, so I think that this green outline is larger than these pits that Abir is referring to, but nonetheless, so to get back to these pits, so these pits are actually collecting water. They're actually rendered unusable because they're turned into pits of water, and they're actually also damaging the land around them that are supposedly still dig. So they need to be treated so they don't harm whatever is around them. But I think that your question is very interesting in that roundtable that also questions the role of the architect. I think that I think we should be debating this a bit later on, but we do believe that the architect should somehow widen his or her scope to tackle larger issues and not only punctual projects. And in that sense, few competitions, the two last competitions that were actually organized by Public Works sort of also called for in architects and other discipline, but also seem to be manageable by architects. And I think that we should also get ready for such challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it's to answer the issue of is it realistic or utopic? This has been debated a lot. It's very important to think of these proposals as proposals that are able to be tools to build alliances for stronger advocacy. So in that sense, yes, they need to use existing tools, existing laws, but they also need to allow us to dream of what could be better. So I think it plays on both of these levels.
Take one last question.
Sorry, I just we're gonna talk more maybe with Think Housing when they're gonna present their proposal. But I noticed in both competition you used the word alternative, and I just wanted you to explain a little bit more. What do you mean by alternative, and why is this word recurring every time you do a competition? And because I feel with the round that we're having, the kind of the role of the architect, and you're saying there's another way of doing things, and what is this other way, and why do you think there's another way of doing it?
Yeah, I think the word alternative is really centered on what you said, that there is another way of doing things. So part of, I think the problem is that we've been stopped from being able to imagine that other things are possible. And so, like I've done research in archives, in magazines ever since the 50s. And these magazine ads, all they do is glorify a real estate and construction sector. And I keep referring to this point because it's really been engrinded in citizens' mind that this is the only way we can actually live and make money. And it's very important to highlight that even within what exists, there is a different way of doing things, a different way of imagining a future life, a different way of imagining how we can live or coexist with the environment, with the territory, with people amongst themselves. And we've been sort of been tamed to think that there is not. So I think alternative plays on the idea of actually using what's there, but thinking about it differently. It's in how we think and how we talk about things that we can start to draw a different vision of what could happen.
Could you give us an example of maybe an alternative solution you found to an issue, or something that that Public Works Studio has been working on?
Yes, and I think also this can be really highlighted in the projects that are going to be presented in the panel. But for example, like one of the projects we had researched is informal public spaces in Beirut. And so we mapped 10 informal football fields that actually the youth in marginalized neighborhoods, they themselves have occupied, have upgraded, have appropriated, have collected money from the residents to actually set up as football fields, and have been creating networks between different marginal neighborhoods for the joy of playing football and of play in general. And so just the mere fact of acknowledging that space can be produced in the city in this way and supporting these practices is in itself an alternative form of understanding the city and of understanding planning in the city. So what we're doing in this project is actually supporting these youth groups and networks in the upgrading and consolidation of these fields with the minimal intervention that could be imagined, because it's such practices that can actually give us hope that instead of always saying there is no public space in Beirut, let's actually look at how people are making and creating spaces of gathering and shared space in the city. This is just one tiny example, but I think this can be elaborated a lot in the group's presentations.
Thank you again, Aribir, for this eye-opening presentation. We're going to move now to a presentation by Ali Khadr, who's an architect, urban designer, and historian. He's going to present his thesis entitled Planning a Sectarian Topography, the Advent of the Modernist Planning Discourse Across Beirut and Lebanon in the 40s and 60s. Ali, please proceed.
Hello, everyone. I think you're all sick of my face today because you've seen it for the past couple of hours. I'm going to take basically a step back and talk a little bit about some historical experiments that were attempted in Lebanon in the 1940s and the 1960s, particularly by one architect and urban planner whose name is Michel Ekochar. But the very wonderful thing, at least about all of the presentations that we've seen today, is that we somehow sort of see that there's one line that is connecting all of these, which is essentially bad planning. And we tend to say that we haven't had experiments with planning, but in reality, we actually have had some of these. So I'm just going to shed some light on the most important examples of those. So, pointer. So, who is Michel Ekochar? Michel Ekochar is a French architect and planner. He was born in Paris. He started his career in Syria in the 1930s as an archaeologist and eventually became the go-to person for French colonial authorities that were looking to plan all of the large cities in their colonies. He works extensively in Morocco, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Syria, and eventually in Lebanon, starting in the 1940s. I'm going to try to go as quickly as possible, so there's quite a bit to cover. So the methodology of this analysis relied primarily on Ekochar's archives in themselves. So I went through his drawings, I went through the text that he wrote, I went through his presentations, his press releases, most of which were in archives that were present in Boston where I was conducting these research, and some of them which were in Geneva in the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And by looking at his original drawings and his text, I was able to sort of take these maps, reproduce them, and start to apply different layers of analysis that would show how these maps could have possibly impacted the way that Beirut could have grown as a city and how it would have functioned in the greater scope of Lebanon. Just a quick overview of his projects in the Levant. He actually starts working in Syria, mostly in Aleppo and in Damascus, conducting archaeological missions. And then from there, in the 1940s, during the Second World War, he's asked by General Georges Cattreau to move from Damascus to Beirut, where he is required to conduct the city's planning. Before that, I'm going to go very briefly through an urban history of Beirut spanning 100 years between 1840 and 1940. And I'm going to try to do this as fast as possible. So 1840, Beirut is a small, insignificant town of about 6,000 people. It was mostly confined within its medieval walls, which it had had for around 700 years. But in the 1830s, there's a brief invasion by Egypt in which Khedive Muhammad Ali reconstructs the port, and when the port is reconstructed in 1830, the city sort of booms and it expands. This is coupled with civil wars that are going on in Mount Lebanon in 1840 and 1860, which push massive waves of refugees towards the city. So we have a rapid expansion, and at the same time, the reconstruction of the city's outlet to the world, which is its port. But then there are internal changes that start to take place inside. All of the mercantile families and the large landowning families begin moving from the center of the city towards the port, appropriating the port district, which was actually the poorest neighborhood in the city. So these people who are being displaced from the port are being pushed outside the walls to the hinterland of Beirut back then, along with the refugees that are coming in from the mountains. By 1890, the city had grown considerably, and it had become the capital of its own wilaya underneath the Ottoman Empire. So now there was actually a lot of agency in structuring the way that Beirut functioned. So the Ottomans invested a lot of money in consolidating the souks with the port by constructing these large avenues, such as Al-Limbi is one of them, but that happens slightly later, but also consolidating, for example, the Emir Bashir axis, which connects Seht al-Sur to Seht al-Birj, which are today the Riyad al-Sulh Square and Martyrs Square. In addition to constructing the Sarai on top of the hill, which means to say we are the powerful group here, we control everything, and everything happens underneath our auspices. At the same time, the city continues to expand southwards and eastwards at a very rapid rate without any sort of planning that is going on. In 1915, the Ottomans initiate a large-scale demolition of the city center, citing the need to introduce hygiene, kind of like Haussmann's intervention in Paris, but with less of a militaristic tone to it. At the same time, the blockade and the famine that's going on in Mount Lebanon is continuing to push people towards the city, and the city continues to expand at a very rapid rate. In the 1930s, with the advent of the French Mandate, an imported urbanity is sort of placed in the demolished city center. The Place de l'Étoile is constructed. It's not completed because they ran into some problems with the landowning families and the church, and so they sort of built a truncated version of it while expanding the port of the city. By 1930, the population is 160,000 people. So in the space of 100 years, the city's population grew by up to 10,000%. In the 1940s, we have an urban structure that looks more or less like this, and I'm sorry if the colors are not very apparent. But basically, Beirut had been growing in a radial fashion, so from the city center, which is the most dense and mixed side of the city, radiating outwards towards the suburbs. If you notice, there are almost no lateral connections between the different neighborhoods. There's not a consolidated series of east-west axes. And this is because mostly, if we go to a social connectivity diagram that shows religious and ethnic groups, this is mostly due to community enclaving. So we tend to think of Beirut as a divided city because of the civil war. This is not actually true. Beirut has always been a city of enclaves, at least when it started growing in the mid-19th century. So we realize, for example, that the center and Ras Beirut, the colors are not distinguishable at all, but I promise you they're actually in higher resolution. The center and Ras Beirut are actually the most mixed neighborhoods in the city because you have a lot of affluent families that are moving there that decided to leave all of these identitarian politics behind. But the second you look outside of these neighborhoods, we already have, you know, the green line axis as a clearly defined boundary between neighborhoods. We already have the area, for example, of Msaitbe as a Greek Orthodox enclave in a largely Sunni area. We already have Beshura and parts of Zat Leblat as this sort of micro Shia zone that is surrounded by people from different religions. So we already have these established neighborhoods and these established boundaries. And if we overlay this map with a map of frequent conflicts and riots and tension areas, we sort of find out that this middle region, which is where a lot of mixity happens, tends to be the most violent. And this is because when you have enclaves such as the Greek Orthodox enclave in Msaitbe, who need to commute to the city center to get to their souks and to where they need to, you know, sell and trade and acquire commodities, they need to go through neighborhoods of different religious groups, which, if any, you know how things happen, I mean, nowadays, some sort of small, insignificant problem leads to a large-scale religious tension. The same stuff was happening back in the 1940s. It's not really any different. It's just happened at a different scale back then. So we realized that this area in the middle, which is basically Marilies, Beshura, Basta, and some parts of Zat Leblat, are actually very tense zones to begin with. Now, when Ekoshar is tasked by the French Mandate to come and plan the city of Beirut, he immediately sort of moves to intervene first and foremost in the newest and the poorest neighborhood in the city, which is Birsh Hamoud, which had been a refugee settlement up until the 1920s, and then after then had started to undergo this slow process of regularization. Now, Ekoshar proposes primarily this very heavy infrastructural project, which is all about consolidating axes in the city, because at that time, let's remember, it's World War II, so the French needed to move their armies as fast as possible throughout Lebanon's territory, and specifically throughout Beirut, in case they needed to evacuate the city if the Germans had advanced from the south. So he proposes this very elaborate infrastructural plan. The most important parts of these are the axes that cross the city from an east-west fashion, the ring that delineates the city center, and then an urbanization plan that moves clockwise from Birsh Hamoud, which again is the newest and poorest neighborhood in the city. So he's immediately proposing its regularization and expansion and the upgrading of the urban fabric over there. And then he moves slowly towards the coast, which is supposed to be the last portion of the city to be urbanized. So in essence, he's not thinking as a planner as much as he's thinking as a social engineer. And this is something that he repeats throughout his master plans, and we're going to see it in a much more accentuated version in the 1960s. Because he always characterizes the state of Lebanon's development, and specifically Beirut's development, as being growth without development. So the city is growing, it's expanding, it's acquiring new neighborhoods, but no sort of social or urban development per se is actually taking place. The 1940s plan is shelved, it's never implemented, because of course it's World War II, there's no money in the treasury of the country, the French were not in any position to invest in this sort of plan, and also the large landowning families in the city consistently were sort of stating their opposition to any form of expropriation that was of this size. And this will come back and become a recurring thing throughout the master plans that are proposed for Beirut. The parts of the plan that are implemented, the movement of the airport from Bir Hassan Jneh to Khaldi, and the implementation of some east-west axes, which is today Shara al-Istiqlal, Independence Street, which takes you from Sassin all the way to Uraitim and eventually to Rawshi. That is actually one of the nodes that were implemented as a function of this plan, as well as Corniche al-Mazra'a, which was earlier proposed but actually implemented following its consolidation in the Ekoshar plan. Now, we fast forward 20 years, but and to give a little context of the state of Lebanon in the 1960s, in 1956, there was an earthquake in the Saida region, destroyed Lebanon's third largest city, displaced thousands of people. In 1952, there was a flood in Tripoli, which also inundated the city center and displaced thousands of people. And in 1958, we had a civil war that conveniently nobody seems to want to talk about, but is actually a very important sort of point of contention in Lebanese history that is often disregarded. So the city is already overwhelmed, and not to mention Israel was created, so we have hundreds and thousands of Palestinian refugees who have come into Lebanon and have settled around Beirut. So we have a southward, east and westward expansion of the city towards its borders along the sea, but also we have the punctuation of the urban fabric with these massive refugee camps which are absorbing both Palestinians and Lebanese who are internally displaced from different portions of Lebanon that have been subject to various forms of either colonial aggression by the Israeli state or by natural forces such as the earthquakes and the flooding, which is generally known as the Belt of Misery by this point. If we move and we look at religious, ethnic, and national groups, we also find that there is a large degree of mixity that is being introduced to the suburbs, which were mostly these small Maronite Christian villages alongside the border of Beirut, which during the Ottoman era were benefiting from these different taxation policies that were happening between the city and the mountain. But now they're being overwhelmed with the presence of some Shia who are being displaced from the south, and also the presence of these Palestinian camps. Birsh Hamoud also grows in a very organic but very rapid fashion, absorbing a large portion of land, but also absorbing some of these different refugee populations that are coming in from different regions. If we look at the tension zones in the city, we see that it's greatly exacerbated. The Ain Meraisi region over here in Clemenceau were key areas in the 1958 war. Most of the battles were taking place over there and in the city center, which is also the main space of protest in case there's any sort of social unrest. But then we start to see these axes moving down and covering all of the regions that are sort of encasing the refugee camps. In 1961 to 1964, Michel Ekoucha returns to Beirut after having spent around 10 or so years planning cities across French colonial Africa. And it is really his experience over there which gives him this idea of socially engineering cities and really thinking of how cities can grow in a very sustainable developmental kind of way. In between 1961 and 1964, he actually proposes 4 master plans. But I'm only going to talk about 2 because I don't have time, and I think I've already over time. So in the 1962 proposal, he plans 3 satellite cities around Beirut, which are consolidated again around these infrastructural axes of circulation. And this city was, these 3 cities would have had a capacity of up to 800,000 people. What's very interesting in this plan is that he moves directly to address the issue of the newly formed refugee camps around the city's suburbs and this sort of very organic expansion of the city. So in a sense, he's saying this is the most important place we need to intervene right now because these people are living in very dire social and urban conditions. And because they're living in these dire social and urban conditions, they are sort of subjecting and being the key localities where a lot of tension and a lot of social unrest is taking place. So again, fixing social problems through planning, or attempting to at least. This project never makes it to the parliament because the size of expropriation required was deemed too large by the largest landowning families of these region, mostly the Tabet family, specifically around here on the coastline. When that proposal doesn't go through, he proposes another one 1 year later. But this one is much more consolidated. The infrastructural intervention is much smaller in size. But for the first time, he actually zones neighborhoods in the city to be demolished, which he calls unhealthy neighborhoods. If we go back and we look at the sectarian topography, we realize that the Greek Orthodox, Sunni, Shia, Protestant enclave in Msaitbe is almost zoned entirely as an unhealthy neighborhood that needs to be demolished. The refugee camps in the south, alongside some areas of Tariq Jdide, areas in Kerm Zaytoun and Dermel and Karantina and Birsh Hamoud are also zoned for demolition. But he proposes the construction of 3 satellite cities. One of them is cropped out from the corner over here, but I'm going to focus on this one. He zones these 3 satellite cities as areas to absorb these populations that are going to be displaced. One of them is the Boulevard al-Nahr, which is, you know, your quintessential modernist settlement. There's a separation of uses, thank you. There's a separation of uses. So you have residential quarters and you have this sort of garden city kind of urban, I'm blanking. You have this garden city sort of organizational system, and it's flanked by these small light industrial quarters, which are supposed to provide the people that are moving to these cities with a way to produce a local economy. Now, the very interesting thing about this proposal is that Ekoucha is essentially saying we want to move Palestinians from the camps, Maronites from Ermel, Armenians from Birsh Hamoud, Orthodox from Msaitbe, Shia from Bashura, and all of these different populations that are coming in from all over Beirut, but they are all sharing the same sort of disadvantaged socioeconomic status into these modernist settlements where all of their micro-identities will be collapsed by this sort of urban form. There's no religious buildings planned here. There's only schools and community centers and gardens. And now the most interesting of his proposals, which is actually the most relevant to what we're talking about today, which is the Greater Beirut Metropolitan Region. So Beirut's borders haven't changed since the 1950s until today. It's still the border of the municipal city, which arguably is to a great degree still the border of the Ottoman sort of wilaya within the nation state of Lebanon, that is not expanding outwards. Ekushar proposes the creation of a greater Beirut metropolitan region, expanding the borders of the city by 480%, encasing 67 municipalities that are added from Mount Lebanon, from the Kazas of El Matan, Babda, Alay, and Baladitain and Shuf, 2 municipalities from the Shuf. Now, this would have meant that the governorate of Beirut would have expanded by 480% to encase 1% of Lebanon's territory, but the municipality would have remained the same size, which will create a political problem down the road, but let's focus on the plan for now. He maps very intricately the forests, the ecological corridors, and the valleys that need to be protected as part of Beirut's natural hinterland that will feed in to the health of the city. The plan he proposes is an extremely low density development of the mountain, an acknowledgement of the existing agglomerations that dot the landscape, such as the city of Shuaifet, Kfar Shima, Hadad, and the protection of the beaches along the south, the agricultural zones, the expansion of the airport, and the construction of satellite cities, which are marked here in orange, around zones of mixed city, which have mixed commercial, industrial, and residential neighborhoods. However, the reason why this plan never actually made it to the government is this. By adding 67 municipalities from Mount Lebanon, we realized that the overwhelming majority of these are Maronite villages, something that the Sunni powerhouses in the city of Beirut were not very happy about. They sort of started recalling, you know, the 1860 war when the Maronites came down from the mountain and the city expanded, and they sort of received these benefits and the abilities to change the way the city works, and they were like, this is not gonna fly with us. So again, because of sectarian divisions and a lack of proper consolidation of power, master planning for a large section of Lebanese territory was systematically shut down. On paper, the Greater Beirut metropolitan area, this is my last slide. On paper, it actually exists as an entity. And this is the degree that I dug up from the National Archives, which are in Hamra, which are in a horrible state, and I really hope you never have to go through anything in there because of how nasty they are. But the first بند or مادة in this decree says تحدث وحدة جغرافية من مدينة بيروت وضواحيها تدعى بيروت الكبرى. So it actually exists as a political entity, it's just not implemented on the ground. And this was signed in 1961, but the very interesting thing about this document is, and here I couldn't sort of restrain myself from writing where is Ekushar, because the architect behind the plan is actually not mentioned in the document. Who is mentioned instead are all of these large land-owning families that belong to these different sects in the country who were actually dictating the way that this works. So we have Joseph Najjar, we have Asim Salem, we have Henri Iddi, we have Amin al-Bizri, and we have Fuad Abdel Bae, each of which belongs to a newly represented group in the new larger Beirut region. But what I really want to look at is here, who are the people who ultimately sign off on this decree, in addition to Fuad Shab. Saib Salam, who by then is Rais Majlis al-Wazara, so not much has changed. Next to him is Wazir al-Tanzim al-Am, I think, or Tasmim al-Am, who is Kamal Jumblat, who is a self-proclaimed socialist who comes from an extremely rich and wealthy land-owning family in the Shuf. And we have Wazir al-Dakhli, who's Abdallah al-Mashnu, who's related to the Mashnus that are still in power today. So essentially, what we're facing in this country is a sort of political feudalism that has been persistent for the last 170 years. And that is what is stopping the ability for us to actually plan our territory and to be able to go forward with this. Thank you very much. That's
Thank you, Ali. Allow me to invite Haralaisi Stouhi to present her proposal for the village of Hammana, or the extension of the village of Hammana, entitled The Rational Management of a Wasted Land.
Hi. Okay. So Okay, hi. So the project that I'm proposing is tackling directly the issue of waste and specifically the waste of land. So by definition, waste is using something carelessly, extravagantly, or to no purpose. This has led me to the choice of the city of Hammena. And to understand how land is wasted there, I'm going to go through its history super quickly. So in the 1850s, the village was confined within a main piazza or a main seha, and no construction was done on the hills. And then in the 1900s, we noticed a horizontal expansion towards the hills, followed by a vertical expansion beyond the famous Sheikh River. And starting the 1930s and 1950s, we noticed the immigration of many wealthy Iraqis, Egyptians, Syrians, and then people from the Gulf who wanted to invest in a more luxurious Hammena, which led to the new allotment project, or the Mashru' al-Dam wal-Farz, that was done in 1983 and that took over this whole new part of it. Okay, so Hammena is basically divided into 5 main parts. The mountains that are super steep and were previously used for terracing for agricultural purposes, but are now completely abandoned. The industrial area that was done in an attempt to liven up the city and bring more income. It was previously used for apple plantation, and it was a failed project. The military area that is now basically used for storing the army ammo and stuff. Okay. And the village, which is the most vibrant part of the city, and it has a very specific mood to it, or a very specific charm that I'm gonna show in the next few slides. And this new area that underwent the Damu Fares project in 1983, that was previously used for agriculture and is now basically a ghost town. So the village, as you can see in the functions map, the commercial functions are located towards the center in the main Seha, and all the residential buildings are scattered around it. And what's super interesting about Hammena is that it's famous for its cherry trees and cherry plantation. However, there are no major fields for plantation. So all plantation is done on the individual scale in the gardens of the buildings, of the residential buildings. And I think that it adds to the feel of the village. And the road network is very natural, and it focuses mainly on the secondary and tertiary roads in order to get to those residential buildings. Sorry. Okay. So this is basically how it looks. This comes in contrast with the new Hammena. So before 1983, this whole area was an agricultural area. And as you can see, the plots were super random in size and shape. And they were used for very primitive terracing for efficiency reasons and cost reasons. So the municipality and the urban planning office came to this area and decided to completely erase everything that they had and create a new road network that is more organized and with the parallel roads that are way wider than we would need there. It looks like this. And they divided the random plots of land into 1,200 square meter lots, and they decided that the whole area is zoned as villas. So this is how the villas look. Which brings us back to the issue of waste. And I think the most, okay. So over the course of 14 years, only 21 buildings were added to this area. So as you can see, okay, so only the red buildings were added to it. And if we were to put all of the buildings that are present in this area next to one another, they would only take up around 10% of the whole thing that they did. So this is the images shown on the Facebook page of Hammena. This is what they expected. They did a few projects to liven up the area, such as a sports center and a shrine. So this is how they expected it to look, but this is how it actually looked. Okay. So my proposal is to redivide the 1,200 square meters plots of land into more narrower and longer plots. So it's a 7.5 by 60 meters land. And this would allow more flexibility, mixity, affordability, and eventually growth. So why is this model, or why could this model be more efficient? By having this long strip of land, we can build multiple units within the same lot. We also have the capability of merging multiple plots in case we want a bigger house. So it promotes affordability. It also helps us eliminate the setbacks between the neighbors. So one house can be on the back of the other house, and it would still be a livable environment because of the very long land. And it focuses a lot on the idea of the garden that is crucial, I think, in the villages of Lebanon. So the master plan would expand over the course of 3 phases, and we would only build the land that we need to build. And all the remaining part would be used for agricultural purposes until further notice. Okay, and if we were to implement this project, it would eventually lead up to a maximum built-up area that is almost the double of the one that is proposed in the zoning. So this is how it's supposed to look. And similarly to the master plan, the plan itself would evolve depending on the need of the people. So we would start with a small 1-floor apartment, and then if we need to add to it, we would add a room, and then another room and a floor. And we can also purchase 2 plots of land in case we want a bigger house. However, this is not the model that has to fit within this land. So in case someone wants to come and build a villa, for example, they can build a villa. Or if someone wants to build a Lebanese house, they can build a Lebanese house. So it's very flexible. And I think that the most unfortunate part of the whole thing, besides the slow growth and the waste of land, is that the municipality and the urban planning office are very happy with the outcome that they have. So when I went there and I tried to understand what's happening, they were extremely happy with the sports center that they did, and the shrine, and the whole area that is for villas, but has like 12 villas. So I think the monetary value of the land increased by a lot when they did this project. However, the livable feel of it decreased a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Hala. I'm going to invite now the winners of the Think Urban competition that was organized by Public Works Studio, the Order of Engineers and Architects in Beirut, and UN Habitat to present their project, Fadi Mansour, Rula Khouri, and Candice Najm.
How do I switch from one slide to the next? This one? Can we center? So we're going to present our winning entry for the competition Think Housing, فكر اسكان, which is the first competition for housing alternatives in Beirut that were organized by Public Works Studio, the Orders of Engineers and Architects, and UN Habitat. And it roughly took place a little bit less than a year ago, or exactly a year ago, I think, right? So Public Works is doing this every year. So our proposal is entitled Protective Housing Ecologies, Preliminaries for a Degrowth City. It's a solution to providing affordable housing in Beirut within an overall strategic vision for the urban development of the city. The current housing situation suffers from a shortage of affordable housing units, and at the same time, there is a high number of vacant units across the city. This is due to a hyperinflated real estate market, where the ownership of property is considered as a safe capital investment as much as it is considered as a habitat. And also due to the large number of new private developments that have been demolishing the existing and affordable housing and heritage buildings, these new developments have been replacing them by a new supply of luxury apartments that does not really match the general demand. So to tackle these issues, we are proposing a degrowth strategy at the urban scale to start imagining, and I'm quoting here, alternative social structures that do not incentivize unsustainable resource and energy use and do not perpetuate inequality. Degrowth is a movement that contests the supremacy of economic growth and seeks to move away from its stressful, damaging, and ultimately impossible task, not by collapse, but by design. End of quote. With a degrowth strategy, development in the city is not primarily based on profitability of the real estate market, but housing is made available on the basis of social need. Housing should not be considered as an investment product, but instead should be considered as a common good, a shared resource, or even a basic human right. So we need to substitute the economic growth paradigm of more, bigger, better, faster for ecologically sustainable and socially conscious models based on care, collectivity, and cooperation. So we have been working on a cluster of 16 buildings in the neighborhood of Marem Khayel, which is subjected to a severe gentrification, as you probably all know about. The implementation of our strategy is addressing the danger of demolishing the existing built and social fabric by proposing to work on the rehabilitation of the neighborhood, of the cluster in that case. The aim is to transform vacant units that are currently not in a good state or in livable conditions, while increasing the number of affordable units. So the overall planning strategy consists of using the existing stock of housing instead of building new buildings. This would slow down the ecological damage related to the high demand for construction materials. It would indirectly address the illegal and poorly regulated extraction of natural resources, such as in the case of the quarries in the mountains that were presented by Abir. At the planning policy level, a set of reforms are proposed to regulate large private developments and incite small tenants to activate their vacant properties. These reforms, which Rula will later get into details, would contribute to a successful operation of what we're proposing and we call the Equitable Rent Program. So this program provides affordable housing for the people eligible for it through the rehabilitation of the existing stock by following guided design principles, which Candice will talk about. It's a program that addresses the cancellation of the old rent law by providing an alternative. To those of you who are not familiar with the old rent law, it has been by default the only way to provide affordable housing in Beirut. Since its cancellation, there are more people losing their homes and being forced to move out of the city. So this is how the proposal takes on an interdisciplinary approach to architecture and urban planning by addressing the social, the ecological, economical, and the political.
So I'll be explaining the ERP, or what we're calling the Equitable Rent Program. It's basically the mechanism or the apparatus through which we are proposing to implement our degrowth strategy at the level of the city. It is a proposal for a housing rental scheme that is different from other rental scheme because it calls for or it will provide for affordable housing, but that will not be designated or fixed in certain areas, which means that the affordable unit will be moving around, or that any unit basically can turn into an affordable unit. This will avoid the segregation of some areas as and their stigmatization as poor areas, or the segregation of certain units within a development into affordable or units designated for the poor. At the same time, it ensures that every unit, whether it is affordable or not, will have a high quality and standard of living. So moving on to how this will work, this is basically a diagram showing how this platform or this ERP will function as a service and mediation platform between those who are seeking housing in the city and those who own housing. So basically, first of all, of course, this platform will basically match the seekers to the homeowners. It will provide housing or affordable housing based on a rental scheme. It will also help owners who subscribe to our scheme but who do not have the means to upgrade or renovate their existing house, for them to be able to put it on the market by subsidizing the renovation works. So we will be able to, through this, to subsidize the renovation works. And also one of the tasks of this platform is to collect the rents and distribute to the homeowners what we're calling the equitable rent. It works as such. The equitable rent is slightly, where's the pointer? So the equitable rent, which we're marking here as R, is slightly lower than the market rent. So rentiers or families who are renting at the market price will create the surplus. This surplus will feed into the subsidy for the affordable units. So the more R, or what we're calling the equitable rent, is close to the market value, the less affordable housing we can subsidize. The more gap between R and M, the more affordable housing we can subsidize. So this surplus will not go into the pocket of whoever is running this platform, like an Airbnb, let's say, system, but it will actually help subsidizing affordable units. And so it's according to the need of the city, we will be actually raising, or at least suggesting to raise or lower the equitable rent in order to respond to the need of the city. So basically this ERP works in conjunction with a research cluster, which will be responsible to do a market analysis and to follow up with the quality of renovation, etc. Both entities, and to fix basically the percentage of affordable housing that is needed in the city. Both entities will work within the realm of the PCH, the Public Corporation for Housing, and within a larger body of governmental entities and institutions, and some reforms that we are proposing. So the main reforms, I'm going to go quickly through them, is basically to sort of regulate the large scale development, because we perceive them as a threat to the existing stock of housing. Another reform is to basically impose capital gain on real estate project, and finally to tax the properties that are empty and that are sleeping and dormant assets that we want to reactivate. Yeah, I guess that's it for the EPR. Candice will follow up with the design guidelines.
So to go back a bit to the Manbkhail cluster, we, oops, sorry. Okay. Okay. Can I zoom out or? I can scroll.
Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, so to go back to the Manbkhail cluster, so basically we did some observations and we talked to a lot of people there, and we observed social practices happening at 3 different levels. First of all, the ground floor level, which you can see on your left, where most of the courtyards and the interstitial spaces and the alleyways were mostly appropriated for spontaneous exchange. So since there is a lack of integrated public space. At the level of the building, most of the balconies and the external staircases were turned into green areas and temporal shelters, whereas on the roofs we saw a lot of temporary structures that were used as habitats. So building on those observations, our intervention strategically intervenes to implement an adaptive, self-sustainable ecosystem that also operates on those 3 levels. The ground floor that you can see here becomes a shared common and evolves as an organic social landscape that tries to bind the cluster's community together with the integration of native plants, recreational areas, informal market stalls, and platforms that actually trigger and house those social encounters, exchanges, events, etc. The habitable space, or the building per se, aims to really become flexible, expandable, and self-sufficient. So all the renovation guidelines will allow for a hybrid space appropriation and will also allow for a potential shrinking and expanding of the living space as per the changing needs of the inhabitants, instead of offering a static, bounded spaces. Also implementing green efficient systems like projecting solar louvers, breathing porous membranes that will filter lights, and most of all, adaptable floor plans. So the roof ecology, which will happen as a roofscape, basically acts as a battery and self-regenerative system for the whole cluster. It will house large collective rainwater recipients that basically address the water shortages in the neighborhoods, and also develop some sort of an urban farming formation that can be both self-built and incremental, that will promote a healthy agricultural production and also a self-sufficient community in the neighborhoods. Also, this resulting roofscape will also help regenerate natural habitats for species regeneration. It's also like a small clin d'oeil. It's as if all the extra allowable BUA turns into houses for birds and greenhouses and so on. So mainly the main scheme aims to implement a degrowth strategy so that this community that already has certain social practices can build upon them and has the potential to start becoming self-reliant. To answer a bit Bernard's question earlier to Abir, we were thinking a bit about the outcome of this competition and about such initiatives. We understand that it is very challenging to implement such large-scale frameworks, especially that it involves so many parties and it operates at so many different layers. But it is an opportunity to raise awareness and to raise some sort of a conscious model that can be sustained by an architect, where the thinking, we're trying to adopt a thinking that is sustainable, adaptable, and inclusive in all sorts of projects. To try and go beyond the design-build process towards an approach that is socially, economically, politically, and sustainably engaged and engaging, to basically very simply promote a healthier living environment.
Allow me first to introduce our two panelists, the extra panelists. Bernard Mallat, who is a registered architect in both the United States and in Lebanon. He is the founder and senior partner at Bernard Mallat Architects, and he has produced works in a number of countries and has lectured and taught various courses in design and architecture in several institutions. He is also the founding member, or one of the founding members of Studio Beirut, an NGO operating as a social and cultural engine. And last but not least, Muna Halla. Muna is an architect, curator, director, and NGO founder. She has her own office, Muna Halla Architect, and she is an executive member in the Association for the Protection of Sites and All Buildings in Lebanon. She did a good job in lobbying for the preservation of buildings such as the Barakat building, which is now transformed into Beit Beirut. She has also founded two NGOs, Irab and Zakira. Welcome again, everyone. We have seen 4 presentations that talk about either modifying, critiquing, or even founding solutions for state-run or government-run problems and decisions. I'm going to start by asking our panel, how can architects and planners either collaborate or take the place of the government in producing policies, taking such decisions, or modifying such decisions, and creating new ones? I'm going to start maybe by asking Abir, since she doesn't have much time.
I think before tackling the state or the government, we need to tackle our own positionalities and our roles. So I think first and foremost, architects and planners need to acknowledge that they're also ordinary citizens, and they need to act from this positionality. So they need to acknowledge that they have also played a destructive role in relation to people's lives and the built environment. It has been highly problematic that people are residents have been so alienated from the tools that help them shape their own lives. We've put a huge distance between residents, citizens, and spatial knowledge or architectural knowledge. And I think it's very important to start from this positionality and try to deconstruct this distance. And for architects and planners to themselves start to be closer to the ground and to the environment that they're tackling and to the people that they're speaking on their behalf. I think this sort of alliance will start in a way to then be able to tackle the government and its policies and build a stronger coalition to how we can problematize and face state policies that we do not favor.
I would like to follow up on Habir, because as an architect, as a practicing architect, you are always faced with a client who wants to do the most with the least contribution to the public good or to the common. And there's always we have the responsibility. We cannot say this is what the client wants, because the client always will want that. So there are many, many times where you are, for example, I know, Bernard, you should have faced this. They want a tower. But even in the regulations, when you build a tower, 50% of the unused land should be gardens, so that you increase the green area in the city. They're not public gardens, but they are green gardens, so they will add to the green area in the city. But we know that, or at least in 2 of my projects, the client wanted to, the plan was sent to Exotica to plan, a plan of a garden, which shouldn't have been Exotica in the first place, but at the same time, they could have done a good job. But they just asked for a beautiful rendering so it can pass in the Directorate General of Urban Planning. And then we know that we have an alternative plan for a parking in that place. So after that, it directly gets transformed into a parking, an extra parking for the visitors, and then nobody, but we do not have anybody from the Directorate General or from the Order of Engineers who would follow up the plans that were approved. The same goes for heritage buildings. For example, when we have a heritage building and somebody wants to build, I was approached for the building of the Khalidi house because the client was somebody I've worked for, and I said I would never work on this project because I would never be able to build anything next to the Khalidi house, which is right above AUB, because anything, and obviously it was going to be a tower, anything would destroy that place. But at the same time, I worked with the Directorate General of Antiquities to make sure this doesn't get demolished. I don't know if that's good or not, because now the tower is so overwhelming that little house is kind of squished. But there is another architect who did it. And so there's always this tension between what if a socially responsible architect or somebody who's responsible wants to do something, then he will have to accept that many jobs will not be taken.
But then also, we've seen in the last 5 or so years that there's been a very large push between architects and planners and even people from multiple disciplines to establish and push forward these social advocacy groups. Specifically sort of, it climaxed with Beirut Madinati in a way, but that sort of systems seem to have worked. But then now we're not seeing sort of anything that builds upon that momentum and pushes it forward. What is stopping all of the NGOs that are run by architects and by planners and by people from different disciplines? Like, what is standing in our way?
I'll say one more thing and give the platform to the others to intervene, but because I'm really in the thick of it, we really need people who are responsible in the Order of Engineers and Architects and in the Directorate General of Urban Planning. And if we do not lobby every time to elect somebody who is responsible, like now we have Jad Tabit. If Jad Tabit weren't there, many projects would have passed with much more dramatic impact on the city. So when we say we really need to engage people in elections, it's not a joke. Naqabati was not something that's trying to just to get somebody to the order, because only that somebody would be able to have our eye inside and to have a responsible person who would actually have a vested interest in good projects, not only in passing projects. So it's very important. It's all connected. Beirut Madinati got Naqabati on, and hopefully Beirut Madinati and Naqabati will get more people on board. But it's a slow process, but it's very important. The political is very important. It's not detached from what you're doing.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. But I guess my question is more of like, how do we mobilize now as people who are working at these educational institutions?
I just think that we need to really believe that change doesn't happen quickly, and this is a really long-term process. So to go back to the example of Kura, there have been people mobilizing there since the 1980s, and their voices have not been heard, the media has not been covering, and it's these types of alliances that we need to be built so that we can succeed in long-term change. It's accumulative, And it's precisely because we've been so Beirut-centric and so like professionals and NGOs just عم بلفوا بفلك بعض يعني. This circle needs to be broken. We need to go beyond the capital. We need to go beyond ourselves, and this requires time. But I do believe that this is something that is possible. Change is possible on the long term.
I want to ask here, we're talking about change. As architects, especially those who practice architecture and have their own offices, how do you see the role of the architect versus that of developers or people or clients that are seeking to make a lot of money out of their projects?
Okay, I'll speak from that kind of standpoint. I believe in everything that is being said, but as you mentioned, there's some people mobilizing since 1985 or whatever, and they still haven't been heard. So, I mean, I think every architect has a duty to do something in their own practice, however small or large. So, I mean, I've been pushing for sustainable projects with my clients since maybe for over 20 years, but now we get more traction. Now it's becoming a more important issue, and we're being able to get clients to respond to this kind of call. So, I mean, if I had to my way, I would actually push clients to be completely off-grid. In other words, you don't rely on the government. You don't care about the government. They don't do anything anyway except abuse you, so you might as well do everything they're supposed to do yourself. Now, that may be costly, or you think it's costly, but there are little things that we can all do. We've done in little projects like the backyard, we put benches on the outside of the building. Now, these benches are not for profit. They're really giving back to the city, to the town, to the city. So if every architect just built in something as simple as that, build in a bench, build in a garbage can in the building that they're designing, then these things that the government doesn't provide will be provided for. We can move back slightly and put a little greenery. We can
recycling.
We can build
that are integrated in the design because
exactly. There are lots of things we can do as architects without just following the rules. We can just push for these things, and our clients will go for them because a lot of them are simple, and they will eventually transform the city. It's just each and every one of us has to do it in their designs when they're given a commission.
I'll also add to this because also this is exactly what I think every architect should do. Like Bernard is saying, a bench outside the building, recycling center inside the building, because everybody, we go now to huge buildings and they're like, where do we put the recycling bins? Because nobody has even thought about, because the garbage doesn't have to stay in the building, it has to be taken away by the, chic natur outside. So they have huge places to celebrate their birthdays, but not a small 5 meter squares for their garbage, which is a huge problem. The other thing is, sustainable energy. We plan. It's crazy how the law is abused. Every tower should have a plan for sustainability, solar panels, collecting rainwater, and every single project that gets presented to the Director General of Urban Planning has all those beautiful drawings of all the solar panels and how they are generating electricity and nothing ever gets implemented. So you actually have a way to get back to those architects and to the developers and say where you shouldn't have your permit because your permit was based on this. You got because to have a tower you have to have an exception, and the exception is linked to giving back to the community. It's never being done. So it's just the way, because the architects also want to just finish their projects and get to another, and they just give the client whatever he wants. So this is where our responsibility comes. And for example, a bicycle parking on the outside of the building, just let's have more bicycles parked, but people don't want anything next to the building. They want their, their guards and their cameras. So we have a lot to do, I think.
Mona, you're saying something very interesting, which is essentially the architect needs to somehow be held liable for decisions that are made after permitting and even after construction.
Because he has signed his permit. He has signed the occupation permit, which says that this is what I am going to apply. but then he just, because there's no accountability. Nobody,
Absolutely.
even now with the order, with all that Jad is trying to do, they need a huge, you know, you need power, staff, and they don't have the staff for this. So there's no accountability, and without accountability, nothing will happen.
But I want to take that and sort of apply it to the vacancy rate that we have in the city right now. In the Beirut Urban Lab, Muna Fawaz is conducting a wonderful research project that is all about studying how much of the built-up area in Beirut since 1996 until today is vacant. And for example, would the architect be held responsible in a case where you have a large number of buildings that are just vacant and yet they're constructed? Even if they violate?
Because the program is not the responsibility of the architect. He could advise the client. I've advised the client for a building in Snoubra that he wanted, you know, 250 square meters because it is on the posh level. And I said, you know, if you do 120, people will take them like this today. That was 9 years ago. And he was not courageous enough, so he said, let's do, I complicated my life because he asked for the first 6 floors to be 2 apartments each, and then the next 6 floors to be the bigger apartments. The 6 floors of the 125 got sold before we started digging, and until today he has 3 empty floors of the upper level. And he said, I wish I took your, you know, sometimes it's not your, it's his money and his thing. But you can, when you sign when you have to follow the law, right? The building law. But we find all the ways not to follow the building law, including squeezing maids into rooms that do not have windows and saying it's a maghsal, it's a laundry place, but we know that it is the maid's room.
And designing double height spaces and then constructing a mezzanine.
And you actually design the change too. I know because my client had another building that was built, and you know, you just are not ethical as an architect if you do that.
I want to ask the team that won the competition, the Think Urban competition, how can we use these loopholes, if we want, or leeways, or lack of accountability that the government is holding us in the benefit of architecture projects, but I'm not talking about small clients, but a neighborhood or a city or at an urban level.
I just want to follow up on what you just said, just a little bit comment, a bit small comment. I think we have to maybe refer to, when we speak of accountability and like the role of the architect, to, because it can be, like the role of the architect can be very broad, so maybe it could help by being a little bit more specific. Like for example, we can speak of different temporalities in terms of engagements of architects, because change comes on the long term, like Abir was saying. So there are the architects who are practicing and who have to come up with solutions, such as what Mona was talking about and Bernard in terms of like proposing a bench or a space for recycling bins. But, and so because there's the urgent, like the obligation of functioning within the existing building law, but then again, there are supposed to be also other architect researchers who are supposed to review those building laws, considering like the new demands and the changes that are going on. And one person, it's very difficult for one person to be tackling both these things at the same time. So, so I think that could be an answer to basically the role of the architect. And this is the importance of research, basically, and of trying to maybe specify or subdivide the different things that the architect can be, and yeah.
Do you see a role for establishments such as the Order of Engineers and Architects in this? Like in coming up with new policies and researching?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. I mean, policy making should be done by, there has to be some research that's done beforehand, and policy making affects the building law, and this affects the way architecture is practiced. So, so yeah.
Maybe to pick up on that, I think we should think of how to strategically build alliances, whether we're architects or planners or other people who are concerned with the built environment. Alliances amongst ourselves and alliances with the state and its and other governmental bodies, because I think, well, there's this famous saying in Arabic, "إيد واحدة ما بتزقف." It is very difficult to put the blame on one person or one discipline or one citizen to change the whole world. And it takes time, and it's even impossible to do it alone. So I think the complicity that has been established nowadays between the state and a certain class or certain discipline needs to be broken. And we can clearly say that the laws and the state have been the complice with the developers and with property owners, like large or big and wealthy property owners, and even real estate agents. These have been, these people have gone hand in hand in order to protect their own benefits. And I think that this alliance needs to be broken, literally, even if broken means sounds a bit violent, because this is really a very damaging alliance for the environment. I think another kind of alliance should be built based on sustainable thinking and more environmentally conscious thinking. One thing I've been thinking about is that architects usually, they think of their clients, the humans, other humans as their clients. Maybe if we think that we have another kind of client, maybe if we think about our planet Earth or the environment as our clients, then we could start designing for not this other person, and also think of the profit that it might, that he or she might make, but of our land, of our environment, or of the community as our client. And I think also this cannot be a burden or the responsibility of us architects, but really of this whole ecosystem and of a new alliance. And this cannot happen without the state being involved, because it is many of these projects are sort of ruled by policies and laws. And unfortunately, even today, we've had good people coming in and out, and even today, this whatever good thing is happening is based on an exception to the law. So we come, there's a big development, so we take it to Majlis al-A'la and we start to bargain. Well, okay, you can get these 2 extra floors, but give us in return this garden. I think that this is very bad. I think that you cannot carry on bargaining on each and every project, because we cannot be there for every project. And if this bargain turns well or good for the city as a whole, then the second bargain will turn into a failure. So I think that this exception and exemption politics that we're dealing with is not good. I think that we should come up with a new alliance and new sets of regulation within which we need to raise awareness for planners and architects and even citizens to take care of their environment.
Okay, I will agree, but at the same time, I'm going to invite architects to do something else, because I think you're advocating for something that can be done, but obviously for years none of this has been done, and a lot of people have been well-meaning. Universities have symposiums, have events like this one. We all talk about it, and then nothing gets done because of the political class. So I think architects are really smart people, and they can think of how it could benefit both. It's got to be a win-win situation. In other words, the client, the rich people, have to benefit. And I think we can find ways of making them understand that there are things that are a win-win for them and for the city, the environment, etc. I mean, nowadays they're starting to understand that sustainability is a good thing because it helps them sell. So fine, use it against them, lie to them. I mean, you're not lying. Ultimately, it is good for them, and it's good for their own project, for their own children that live in the city. We can actually convince them by helping them make money while fixing the environment, and I think it can happen. And fixing planning, it's just, if we just stop relying on everybody else and stop having wishful thinking. Of course, we have to build alliances, and we should continue trying, but in the meantime, we as architects that have practices have to just be much smarter about what we do and try to push as much as we can to get things done that are interesting. You were talking about photovoltaic panels. I mean, we did a project where we built 20,000, or we designed 20,000 square meters on a piece of 2,000 square meter land, right? But if we had made it a park, we had more green after building or after designing. Let me go back because it wasn't built. After designing 20,000 square meters on this land, more green than if we had made it a garden. So there was more. There was, I think, it was a 1,970 some square meter land, and we had a total of 2,600 to 2,700 square meters of greenery after building this building, right? Because you can, this is surface that you're building and you can green it. There are roofs you can green. There are things you can do as an architect, as a designer, and you can make a change.
Well, you said that nothing is changing. I mean, some things are changing, no? Like, for example, if it wasn't for Mona, we wouldn't have built Beirut, right? So, it took 25 years. Yes, but I mean, there's a lot of people like Mona also who are working, even if it's, basically what I'm trying to say, that even working at small scale does matter. Like, even if you're teaching at university and you teach your student in a specific way, there is value to that, right? Because education is also very important if you want to start talking about the role of the architect. I would actually, even though it might sound a little bit like utopic, but I would actually favor more of a structural change in terms of this relationship between the developer and the architect, rather than trying to find this like win-win situation that you have been describing. I mean, of course, for the time being, there still should be this quest for a win-win situation, because when you're faced to the need for survival as an architect and gaining a salary, the only thing you can do is actually get projects and work your way around them with your own values and the demands of the developer. But if we remain within this status quo, things are not going to change. I mean, a little bit more photovoltaic panels, a little bit more trees, yes, but on the long term, this is not really effective change.
I may disagree about the long term, but I absolutely agree that we should have structural change. I'm just saying, meanwhile, we can't wait. We've waited 30 years, and things are getting worse in many ways. So, I mean, what you've accomplished in Beit Beirut is amazing, but I understand that you weren't very satisfied, for example, with some of the decisions by the architect. I mean, for example, it wasn't a competition, right? Was it?
Of course,
and it
the
should have
first
been.
mistake, yeah.
Right, so, I mean, that's one way, for example, that we can affect change. You guys won a competition. Competitions are fantastic. They're one of the best ways to change the urban landscape, right? They can change, I mean, architecture obviously is very important to me and to a lot of people here, and it's because it actually represents our culture, right? It is us, and when we see what's out there, it's scary, what we are. Because if we see our environment, we realize that in many ways we're a failure. And there are shining successes like yours and others, maybe things that were done, and we've got to do more. And competitions, I think, are essential, and we should probably lobby and work with the Order of Engineers and Architects to try to lobby the government for every single project that is a public project to become a competition. They do have bids for the financial aspect, and they should be the same for design. I mean, no public project should be designed by a private individual or an architect that was designated to design this. It should be a competition, and an open competition at that, not even a limited competition, in my opinion.
I just wanted very quickly to, I've been for 2 years not a practicing architect because I refused to do a project for Erbil or Saudi Arabia, and there are no projects that are happening, at least on my scale, in Beirut. And so I moved to the neighborhood initiative at AB, and I decided to do something of a change on my level. And for the past 2 years, we have implemented many interventions, but 4 are permanent and have changed the landscape of the city. There is now on John Dark Street, we have implemented the pedestrian-friendly street with the municipality. So I would say we have started the complicity that is against the other complicities with the governor and with the municipal council. And in that street, now we have the first open public library, which yesterday evening, somebody put a huge number of books for children, and all the street children were sitting and looking through those books. We have the first bicycle parking on Abdelaziz Street, where you can actually tie your bike to a real bicycle structure, not to a tree or a pole. And we are everything we're doing, we're proposing it as a pilot for the city. So we go to Jamal Aitan and say, this is working, please propose it to the council for other places in Beirut. Remove all those concrete things that you block cars from parking, and put bicycle parking or motorcycle parking, so at least the city looks nice and the people use it more. We have recently rehabilitated with our students, District D from the Urban Planning, Masters of Urban Planning. If you haven't seen it, I invite you all to see it. The staircase that's called the Ain Mraisi stairs. It's a stairs that just was, forgotten at the EZA. It starts at the top of the EZA corner, down Jevinor, and goes down to the sea. So we asked them to enliven it to become a vertical playground. And now there are talking pipes that people, grown-ups and children, can talk to each other from the beginning of the stairs to the bottom of the stairs. And there's a 24/7 sound of the sea live. You can hear the sound of the sea because Jamil Brahim has blocked the sea totally. So instead of seeing it, you actually feel it through the sound, day and night. So we did the telecom. We went to the Ministry of Telecommunications, got an FM channel 106.5, and broadcasted the sound of the sea live from the Fisherman's Port. So you can, and now it was supposed to be for a week, for the week of sound, but I paid for it. Sorry, we paid to make it permanent. And when it was done, the municipality came and said, bravo, that's very good, let's keep it. So if you can find your way to things. And the thing that we are now very proud of and working, it's the 3rd year we are working on, Nathalie Harb wanted to propose a raised garden over the parkings in Beirut, because we don't have garden space, and we will not have garden space. We have lots of parkings. So we designed it with her. She implemented it in the first design week in 2018, and in 2019 we won with the Goethe Institute to develop this project to become a permanent project. And as we speak, SOM are planning the mobile foundations because they donated that. And when we have it, we will have a garden in every parking in Beirut that will cost the parking per people nothing. So it's just how you frame your interventions, and you can do a lot outside the legal framework.
I have one last topic, and then we'll open the floor to the audience for questions. Just want to see the role of architects as teachers. What are universities teaching students, and are they just forming practitioners? Are they forming activists? Are students just becoming tools seeking money out of architecture?
Sorry, I wanted to answer the small debate that was between Fadi and Bernard. It made me think about something, is that, yes, we have a lot of architects that have a conscience, but we have also so many architects in the city that really have sans foi ni loi, that just want to get their buildings out there and put their names on it. We have clients that can be talked into having a more ecological approach, and we have maybe 99% that needs equation and numbers, etc. So it can make us think that maybe the order of client, architect, and then a specific order to get the project approved is somehow maybe not working, and maybe we should start thinking about the clients proposing a project directly to this order, and this order having a team of interdisciplinary planners, sustainable researchers, etc., that will probably set the guidelines and then release it to A, B, C, or X architect in the city to develop it further. So there is a bit also, especially in our country still, the cult of the architect or the name of the architects. This is something that needs to be broken down a bit into a more inclusive and yeah, a collective effort towards putting a project out there. So yeah, this is something your discussion made me think about.
I'm just going to quickly answer to your question about the role of the teacher. I've recently graduated from LAU, and I think that I was basically pushed a bit towards doing this project, but I'm glad that I was. And I think that the role of the teacher in forming the activists or the people who would like to make a change at some point is a huge role.
Well, I do teach, not this semester, but I have taught for many years, so I can speak to, I don't know about activists, we do sensitize the students to a lot of these issues, of course. And depending on the professor, of course, or the instructor, there are different leanings. You know, some instructors tend to be more, push more for advocacy, others social practices, they emphasize certain things like that. But I mean, there's room for everything. Of course, we have to perhaps rethink things. We have a model that is a American model at this university and at LAU and other universities. Perhaps we can make our own. Obviously, we have problems that are different than other problems in other cities and in other countries. So we should probably rethink some of the things we do. We have a lot of things that are in common with a lot of other countries. So it is a strange question that you've posed. I mean, a pertinent question, because we're all talking about what should be done, and we don't know quite, we're not quite sure how to make these things happen, and it's very difficult to make them happen when they're not us. This is one of the reasons I was advocating for the architect to try to do as much as possible herself or himself, right? You've got to do as much as you can. But of course, grassroots movements and associations and things like the Order of Engineers or NGOs are very important, and they're becoming more and more common in this country. There's so many these days, especially because they started working on the Syrian crisis and such things. Perhaps as the Syrian crisis comes to an end, some of these can be consolidated to do other things, and you know, people can be encouraged to start working on other issues, which are issues that are purely Lebanese, and you can enroll a lot of this energy and get it to work for us.
I know you want to wrap up, but I'll wrap up with this because you talked about that. We are very lucky at the American University to have started 10 years ago, but maybe with me the past 2 years it's more effective on the ground, but the Neighborhood Initiative, it's called the Neighborhood Initiative. So it aims that the university intervenes in its neighborhood in a positive way and in an impactful and to implement change. And if every university takes it upon itself, imagine if USG does it in Ras Al Naba and in Mono, and BAU, Beirut Arab University, does it in Tariq Jdide, and LAU does it in Raitem and Laban. And if every small university does this with its students, then imagine how much change we can do on the level of the universities on them alone. And I invite you, Bernard, for your next course to give a project to your students, which we will implement. We will not only, we will fund, we will implement, and we will present as a prototype for the city. Rana Haddad and Pascal Hashim have done 2 projects with us. One of them is the bench that was removed for a totally different reason. But I mean, when you give the students the fact that they are not only dreaming, what they're dreaming is on the ground. District D are 4 students that have now their project forever in the city while they were in the university. So I think if every teacher once every year gives the students a practical problem, and actually now we are here to help our students, but in other universities even the teacher can do this job, and then you will push your students to actually not only dream of something that's going to change the city.
Thank you. We'll take one last comment from Ali, and then we'll move to the audience. Oh, you know? Okay. Questions?
I wanted to ask a question, but maybe I'll pass around. I wanted to ask questions, especially to Mona and maybe Bernard, and of course Fadi, but the question of, because we are in this round about the role of the architects, and we all know, and us as an NGO, we noticed that when we started the NGO and unemployment rate as an architect in this country, and everywhere in the world, but in this country is much more complicated, we noticed that we had so many volunteers that wanted to help, so we didn't understand at first what was happening, why was so many volunteers coming here, and interns, and they wanted to help and everything. And I was actually wondering is that we all know that at the end of the day, all of these architects that are graduating from these schools, most of them, if not 99% of them, are not going to build. What can they do? Like, maybe us as a collective, we started this initiative to also empower these young professionals and tell them there's another way to do architecture. There's another way to be an architect in the society rather than just building. And I wonder, in your opinion, what can an architect, what's the role of the architects today due to unemployment? Like, it is a factor that we need to take in consideration. Like, how can they make a living? How they can continue practicing in architecture?
No, I think that specific, I don't know, I can only see it from the way, because that's exactly what I'm doing. I mean, we're trying to plan small interventions that would be funded, so the architect, or mostly our architects who are working, would get paid in order to do a small the design. And think, I didn't say that we also, Ramzi Ali, who's an architect, he resigned, and it's only 2 weeks that it has been there, a tawle, a backgammon table made of concrete on Jean d'Arc Street. So I asked him to design something for this bench to make it a playing thing. Of course, everybody thinks of a chessboard, but backgammon is more relevant to our society. And we placed it next to a 24/7 where they can take the things. So you can come up with project. The city is full of things that you need to do. There's not one single thing that you cannot do in the city. You just have to be creative and gear instead of designing a building, design something much smaller, because with it, if your intervention costs $2,000, I can definitely do it tomorrow. So design it, take $1,000 for you to design it, build it for 2,000 and have it in the city and replicate it 20 more times and take on each one another $300, $400. So you might want to quit your architecture and do this, because it might be much more fun. So.
Again, it's a tough question. Obviously, all architects that are graduating today are in trouble. And as someone who hires architects sometimes, right? Nowadays, not so much, since the situation is pretty bad. But we have work outside the country, so sometimes we're able to take on new architects. I would advise the graduate architects to first hone their, if they have time, and they're not doing much, to learn new technology, first of all, because this is one thing that helps us make a decision when we hire someone, because obviously the world is getting more automated. There's AI. There was a presentation earlier that talked, I think Adrian Lahoud talked about AI and how they use it to further the profession. There's generative design now that is starting to come along, and is a scary thing, and at the same time it's very interesting, right? In our firm we do a little bit of things like Dynamo, which is scripting rather than just designing by hand. There's some scripting going on, so technology is taking over. Students who are more proficient will get more opportunities, I think, as time goes by, although Lebanon is slower in general when it comes to adopting these new technologies. The other thing they could do is obviously join groups and make change. And if there's a lot of them out there, they can actually probably lobby pretty well and make a difference. Because if you're all out there and you really want to make a real change, then by all means. Maybe we need fewer architects. There may be too many of us out there already, and people like me who've been around for a while probably should retire to let other people go or something like that. But it's a difficult thing to do, right? Everybody wants to survive. Everybody wants to fight to get somewhere, and it's going to be a hard battle in the next few years, I think, unless things change.
And to add on what Bernard was saying, I think it's important to specialize in something. Just being an architect is not proposing something enticing enough nowadays. So, and there are a lot of things happening, like Bernard was saying, and it's very important to start having some sort of a niche to propose something that someone will recognize you beyond just being an architect. Researching new sustainable materials where you can build in other things than concrete and steel. There are so many things we can turn to. Again, being a very sustainable says how to implement sustainable facades into all those old derelict buildings. This can be also another initiative. Going into more urban, small insertions. So really trying to specialize and open up a niche that would be enticing enough to become a label beyond the label of the architect.
Thank you. Do we have any more comments from the audience? No? Okay. So thank you again, the members of the panel. And thank you to our presenters. Just to wrap up, going to give the stage to Edouard to wrap up.
No, it's just going to be a minute just for us to give like a closing speech from the Collective for Architecture Lebanon. First of all, we want to thank AUB, the American University of Beirut, for giving us the space. Second, we really want to thank BIT Beirut and the municipality for giving us the space for the exhibition. And I hope that each of you can go and see our exhibition until the 11th of September. I really want to thank everybody who were on these 4 panels. It's our first edition as OMRAN, an architectural forum. We hope to do it every 2 years. We hope that it's going to be an event that every architect in Lebanon and in the region will attend. We really hope that you enjoyed it, that you learned from all of our speakers. These 4 themes that we chose for the conference, which are global and local infrastructure, resources, production spaces, public space and domesticity, and the role of the architect, are really themes that we thought were really important to discuss and to debate among ourselves. And as a closing speech, I would say thank you for everyone and hope to see you again in another event. Thank you.